Hello, this is Noah Wisman, and I'm making a video about um, making effective presentations. And the reason I'm making this video is because I teach classes where I ask students to make presentations, and I am not fully satisfied with the advice that's out there if you just kind of casually look it up about the presentation making process. If you look up information about how to make effective presentations, um, you'll get a lot of different competing opinions. There will be people telling you different things. Sometimes it will seem like those things are contradicting each other, and there can be a question of, where do I start and who do I trust? Um, a good example of this comes from YouTube. If you search something as simple as like effective presentation or effective presentations into YouTube search bar, you'll get a lot of different videos from a lot of different sources, and they'll all kind of be promising to give you the secrets of good presentations, the 3 or 4 or 5 rules that are will lead you to making the best presentation as possible, and they'll focus on different topics as well. They'll talk about presentation skills, leaving an impression. They'll talk about ways of speaking. They'll talk about uh, ways to actually create the presentation itself, the slides, tricks, tips, everything along these lines. And the question I think that you're faced with if you are trying to learn how to make good presentations, you want to get better at it, is again, which one of these sources are telling me good information, which ones are not, why does it seem like everyone is saying something a little bit different? So that's what I wanted to make a presentation about myself, to be able to give you kind of a big picture idea of what's going on, to give you more the tools to make your own decisions rather than a series of tips, tricks, or rules. Okay. In my opinion, one of the reasons why there is such varied advice about giving presentations stems from the fact that people have different goals when making presentations. One of the most important things to ask when you're making a presentation, when you're making the slides, or when you're practicing to deliver it, is you need to consider the question of what are you trying to accomplish? And this is an important step when you're beginning any project, a presentation included. There are a lot of different reasons to make a presentation. There's a lot of different motivations you might have when designing your presentation. What constitutes an effective presentation depends on what those goals are. For example, are you trying to teach people information directly? You're trying to sort of educate people? Or are you trying to hype up a product? You're trying to sell something? Are you trying to inspire people? Are you trying to affect them emotionally? Are you trying to make yourself look good? Do you want to come off well as a presenter? Seem professional? Seem competent? Do you have to adhere to certain standards? Are there rules on the assignment that you've been given? Are there professional standards for the conference that you're going to be attending? Do you want to entertain people? Do you want them to laugh at the things that you say or find them heartwarming or heartbreaking? Are you trying to make something that you can publish? Are you trying to make something that you can use as a review resource? Are you trying to sort of double dip on the material that you're creating? All of these considerations play into the creation of any individual presentation. And a lot of the times these things are in competition with each other. If you want to pursue one goal, you'll have to give up on another goal. A good example of this is you can think about, what would your goal be if you're trying to teach a class of high school students? in terms of the presentation that you're giving, especially maybe of your peers. Maybe you are concerned about being entertaining. You want them to sort of like your presentation and be engaged by it. Maybe you want to come off well. You want to come off as someone who has interesting ideas, did a good job, but maybe isn't like too cool, too invested in it. You know, maybe you're still a little bit cool and detached. I don't know what your priorities are with your friends, but those are the kinds of things you might have as priorities teaching a classroom, presenting in front of a classroom. By contrast, let's say that you were going to give a more professional presentation. Have an example here, a presentation being given for the US Army. Are you going to conduct yourself in the same way in that presentation? Are you going to prioritize the same things? Probably not. Maybe you'll be a little more formal. Maybe you'll focus a little more on technical information. It depends. Again, this is a very consistent theme with any project, presentations included. You know, who's your audience? What are you trying to accomplish? That's the first thing that you need to consider. One of the reasons why there is competing advice about how to give a good presentation is because different sources make different assumptions about what your goals are. And they'll talk to you, they'll give you advice as if that is what your goal is. The skill of making and delivering good presentations is all about being able to match to your goals. Where first you need to figure out what your goals are with the presentation that you're giving, and then you need to create the appropriate presentation to reach those goals. Okay, that's what this video is going to be about. This video is going to attempt to kind of put these different considerations, these different goals together, discuss the options that you have and their effects, more so than giving you a specific formula or routine to follow. It's going to try to help you, put you in position where you can figure out your own goals and then match to them accordingly. There's going to be kind of two halves to this video. The first half will talk about the big picture, the common goals that you might have as a presenter. And the second half will talk more about advice, which can help you reach those goals. Specifically, the advice that I'm going to give in this video is the kind of advice that works kind of regardless of your setting or your specific goals. It's just generally good advice. That's going to be the idea. But we'll talk more about that when we get there. Okay. Now, in this video, I'm going to cover, again, in the first half of this video where we talk about common goals, I'm going to cover 5 of them. There are more than 5, but I think that these 5 goals that I'm going to discuss that you might possibly have are very common, especially to assigned presentations. You have to give a presentation for your class in school. You have to give a presentation at your job, at a meeting. Presentations that you've been assigned the task of giving, these goals will be very common in those contexts. Okay, so just to quickly introduce each of these goals, the first goal I would call education. This is a common goal of a presentation that's being given, or someone giving a presentation, where you want people to actually learn about the topic, the subject, the issue that you are presenting about. You're presenting about global warming, you want people to learn about global warming. You're presenting about law and legal concerns, you want people to learn about law and legal concerns, you want them to leave that room knowing more than what they knew when they came into it. Okay. That's one of the common goals of presentations. Another one is emotional impact. It's another common goal of presentations, where When you give the presentation, you want people to be affected by the presentation on an emotional level. You want them to care about the topic that you're presenting on. You want them to enjoy the presentation. You want them to be engaged by the presentation. For example, if you're presenting about global warming, you don't just want people to know more about the topic at the end of it. You want them to care about the topic. You want them to be concerned about the topic. You want to create an emotional impression on the attendee, not just a knowledge-based impression. These two concerns here, education and emotional impact, kind of overlap and contrast with each other, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about them individually. Sometimes they support each other, sometimes they're in conflict with each other. Okay, another common goal is to come off well, is the way that I'm going to phrase this, which basically just means that you want people to think that you are a good presenter. You want them to like you. You want them to think that you're competent. You want them to think that you know what you're talking about. You don't want to embarrass yourself. You don't want to stumble over yourself, get confused, get lost, seem like you don't know what you're doing. Very often, I think that coming off well it's often kind of an unspoken top priority. Or for example, it's somewhat unusual for a teacher who's assigning you a presentation to give to tell you that, hey, the primary thing you're going to be graded on in this presentation is how well you come off. But often it's the number one thing that the student actually cares about because they don't want to embarrass themselves in front of the class, in front of their friends, and in front of the teacher. So if in a typical presentation assignment, maybe the content of the presentation is worth like 50%, maybe the slide designs are worth some percent, and maybe presentation itself is worth like 20%. But to the student, it's worth like 100%. It's the number one thing they care about. Very common. Okay, the next major goal that you might have with a presentation that you're making is publication, where you may want to share, reuse, and get credit for the presentation that you make. This isn't typically such a big consideration when you're making a presentation, say, for a class that you're in, or again, just for your job. There, you're expecting just to give it in that one meeting or in that one class and then not think about it again. But it becomes more important the further you go, the higher up you go, so to speak. The more effort you put into your presentation, the more it's about an interesting subject, the more you might think about, hey, maybe I want to post this somewhere. And then you have to think about those kinds of considerations. Okay, and the final goal you might have, common goal you might have, is meeting expectations or limitations that are imposed on you. If you're in a class, there's going to be some rules about the presentation that you're giving. It has to be a certain length, it has to have a certain content, it has to have citations, etc. If you're giving it a job setting, work setting, there's also going to be rules and expectations that you need to live up to. These expectations and limitations vary quite a bit from context to context, so I won't focus too much on them in this particular presentation. Hopefully, by giving you a good idea of how to present effectively in general, get you thinking about how to do that, you'll be able to figure out how to meet whatever expectations are being put on you in whatever context you happen to be in. So this will come up, but we won't necessarily focus on this. Okay. Again, there are other goals that a person could have when making a presentation, but these are very common ones here. Okay. So let's go ahead and talk about some of these individual considerations. The first one we'll talk about is education. itself, where you're trying to really teach people about the subject that you want them to learn about, that you're presenting on. Education is often the presumed goal in school and training contexts. Where if you're making a presentation for a class that you're in, your teacher will kind of assume that the main goal of that presentation is to educate your classmates about the subject that you learned about. It's put on by default. But of course, not all presentations are designed with education primarily in mind. Many presentations are designed more, say, with entertainment in mind, and we'll talk about that later. So it's the default in school settings, but it's not the only reason to make a presentation. A lot of the thinking that I'm aware of and that I know about in this vein of trying to make an education that can trying to make a presentation that can effectively educate someone comes from a line of research uh, which was done in the 90s to 2000s primarily by the researchers Richard Mayer and Roxana Moreno, emphasized in this paper here, 9 Ways to Reduce Cognitive Load in Multimedia Learning. I would say that much of the research that's been done in the field of educational psychology, which is my discipline, focuses on how to make presentations that are specifically good at educating people as opposed to meeting those other standards that we talked about, other goals. So this article here is a good article to read if you're interested in making effective presentations. It talks a little bit about the background of why we believe that certain principles exist, and that does a good job of describing each of the principles of making good presentations. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of each of these pieces of advice in this video. That's sort of beyond the scope of this video. But when I talk about the advice for making effective presentations, I'll talk about some of the points that this article makes that I think are digestible. If I had to kind of summarize the results of this research in a more heuristic way, I would say that the primary pieces of advice that come from this line of research are: don't overwhelm people and don't confuse people. There's a tendency when people are presenting to try to communicate too much too quickly. You've got a lot of things you want to say, you're feeling a little bit amped up, you're feeling a little bit nervous, you talk too quickly, you put too many words on the slides, you try to jam too much into too small of a time period. It overwhelms people. And when people feel overwhelmed, they can't learn as much because it sort of goes in one ear and out the other. The other thing is we don't want to confuse people, or maybe we don't want to distract people. It's common for people to include elements in their presentations which are kind of distracting from the main point of the presentation, or which force people to do some kind of mental gymnastics to figure out what's going on. And in general, you want to try to avoid doing that as much as possible. Again, we'll talk a little more about this, how to approach doing that, when we get to the advice section of the video. This line of research, which was started by Mayer and Moreno, has been followed up on by subsequent researchers. Notably, Jan Plass and Bruce Homer have worked together on a number of studies which have looked into design more with an emotional angle, where Mayer and Moreno are focused exclusively on an educational angle and trying to teach people as much as possible. The trend in research is to focus more on how to get people to engage with the material, be emotionally affected by the material, and on how that can lead to greater learning. Again, just sort of a line of research to look into if you're interested. I'll be covering it briefly in this video. One of the sort of key takeaways from this line of research is there's a tendency when people present to want to cover everything that they learned about the subject that they learned about. But again, this typically overwhelms people. It's very important to parse to the key ideas, to narrow down the scope of your presentation to just what really is going to matter to the people who are watching the presentation. That way, you're not going to overwhelm them and you're not going to confuse them. You're going to present the key ideas to them, give examples of those ideas, sit with them, make sure that people really understand them. Okay. The next major goal that we'll talk about when we talk about presentations, effective presentations, is the goal of emotional impact, which again is anything in the presentation where you're trying to get people invested, interested, having strong feelings, positive feelings towards the subject that you're talking about. You're trying to get them to care about it. There are a lot of common pieces of advice about how to do this. You may have noticed that a lot of the YouTube videos that we saw before are essentially focused on this priority. The trick to powerful public speaking, things like magic ways of successful presentations. A lot of these are going to be focused on trying to affect the emotional state of the person who's watching your presentation. It's a common concern. Things like personal stories, jokes, graphics, graphic designs, images, having sort of open questions, having a hook you'll often hear about, how to start the presentation off well, get people interested, get people invested early. These are the kinds of things that are given as advice to create an emotional impact. The main concern when you're talking about emotional impact, I would say, is twofold. The first is that this is a bit of a subjective topic where it can be hard to give advice about how to create an emotionally impactful presentation because it's hard to know what's going to emotionally impact an audience. Okay, you thought of a joke, but are people really going to laugh at it? It can be hard to say ahead of time. The other main consideration with emotional impact is that it's possible for all of these ways of trying to engage people to actually be distracting from the actual point or the actual content. You can spend so much time entertaining people that you never really actually talk much about the actual topic that you want to communicate about. This can be seen the most clearly in presentations that are advertisements, especially for products that are maybe a little bit suspicious. Sometimes distracting from the actual point is the goal because you don't want people to know much about the actual product itself or the topic itself. A good example of this comes from, I think, can be seen in some of the material that exists about Herbalife. Herbalife is a company that sells nutritional supplements, and I can make this point using a lot of different companies and advertisements, but I'm going to make it with Herbalife because they're broadly criticized as being probably a scam. And because of that, it is very important to them to be able to make a presentation about their product that doesn't actually convey that much information about it. Because if the presentation did convey a lot of information about the actual product, you would conclude that the product isn't very good and you wouldn't buy it. This here is an ad that Herbalife did a couple of years ago, 9 years ago, with the soccer player Cristiano Ronaldo. And if you look at the ad, and this is very common, again, they're not the only ones who do this, but the ad is pretty much all about Ronaldo's sort of daily training regimen. It gives a lot of personal stories, testimonials from Ronaldo himself. It shows him using the product. It shows him training. It shows him practicing. Again, it spends a lot of time trying to affect your emotional engagement with the Herbalife product. It wants you to associate positive feelings with the product. You like Ronaldo. You like how good he is at soccer. You should like our nutritional supplements. One thing you'll notice is missing from the video is really any information about the product itself. Ronaldo talks about how he takes the product and how he feels when he uses the product, but there's almost no information about like what exactly it is and what it does and what the evidence is or is not for its effectiveness. It's a presentation that's almost entirely geared towards making an emotional impact on you to try to get you to have positive feelings, rather than communicating any actual information. When you finish watching this video, you know almost nothing more about Herbalife's product than you did before when you just knew it was a nutritional supplement. That's basically the only thing you know at the end of it. By contrast, here's a video from nutritionfacts.org, Herbalife supplements and liver toxicity. And this presentation is very clearly much more focused on education and much less focused on emotional impact. This video discusses a series of research that's been done, which has found that some of Herbalife's dietary supplements may actually increase the level of toxins in your body rather than being beneficial at all. And this was published 1 year ago, so this is pretty up to date. And you'll see that pretty much the whole video is just screenshots of research papers that have been done. Most of the content of the video just covers the findings of those research papers in a very direct, very clear, very straightforward kind of way. There's not a lot of appeals to your emotion, and you might find the video to be kind of boring if you're not interested in the topic itself. There's not a lot of personal narratives, there's not a lot of jokes. There's a lot of discussions of evidence and how strong the evidence is, and research methods, and all of these sort of technical subjects, which again, if you're not already interested in, you're not necessarily going to find that engaging. That's because the priority of this video is to educate you about the findings about a series of topics rather than to affect you emotionally. Not that the video is trying to be boring, I'm sure they don't want it to be unengaging, but the priority is towards education. You can see that in the way that they're attempting to present the information. Very different style between the two videos because they're trying to accomplish different things. Okay. Now, this consideration here between, again, sort of emotional impact and educational impact, it doesn't have to be a competition. Ideally, you find ways to integrate engagement and education, where you tell a story and that story helps to communicate valuable information about the topic you're discussing. That's the ideal way to do things. This is kind of a skill that requires practice, but you want to look for those opportunities where you can both tell a joke that also makes a point. Okay. Which leads us to the next major goal, which is coming off well. Again, trying to give the presentation in such a way where you don't embarrass yourself and you seem like you know what you're doing. And I mentioned that emotional impact is one of the major goals that you'll see if you look up information about how to give a good presentation. However, coming off well is probably really truly the number one goal. Again, if we look at these series of presentations here, many of them are about how you, the presenter, can come off well when you are delivering the presentation itself. How to practice speech or presentation, some tricks that force you to stop rambling, how to be confident when presenting, all of these, the trick to powerful public speaking, want to give a presentation. Many of these videos are focused on the actual delivery of the presentation itself, how to come off well when you are delivering the presentation. Once again, there is a lot of common advice that comes with this kind of approach and priority. Clear speaking is often emphasized, not stuttering, not pausing too much, communicating things well, enunciating, clear speaking, keeping your eyes up is often discussed, not checking your notes very much, looking out to the audience, either behind them or at someone in particular, just sort of keeping your eyes up. You'll also hear things like, good posture, tone, confidence. These are all of the things that are kind of emphasized in these advice videos. However, I kind of have an issue with the sort of common advice that's given in terms of giving good presentations, because you can find a lot of examples of people who don't live up to these kinds of standards, who don't always speak clearly, who do ramble and mumble, who don't put their eyes up, and who seem kind of awkward and confused, who are nonetheless effective presenters, undeniably effective presenters. And therefore, that may make you question how essential these elements really are to an effective presentation. I think one of the best examples of this is Elon Musk, who you may have heard of. He's the CEO of Tesla and some other companies, SpaceX. And he is unusual as a CEO because he has a very prominent public image. And that public image really affects the way that people view his companies and the choices that they make around those companies. Whatever you think of him personally and whatever you think of the way that he runs his companies, you can't deny that he has a very large public persona, that he makes a large impact when he speaks, and that he resonates with people and with the people who invest in his companies. That wouldn't be possible if he was truly an ineffective speaker and presenter. With that said, he doesn't do a lot of the traditionally effective things. He frequently stumbles when he speaks. He tends to ramble. He often gets lost and traces back to things he said previously. He often comes off as being unconfident in some of the statements that he's making. And as you can see here, he doesn't always hold eye contact with the audiences that he's presenting to. And yet, people resonate with the speeches that he gives. Another example of this is the stand-up comedian Mitch Hedberg, who was mostly active in the 90s and 2000s. You may or might not have heard of him. I've picked him as an example because he was a successful stand-up comedian. A lot of people liked his material. He was fairly successful, but he had a style of delivery which is once again very much opposite to the kind of typical advice you'll get when you look at how to come off well. And I picked him because he very evidently didn't live up to these standards. You can see that he often presented wearing sunglasses and specifically would look down at the floor quite a lot when he was delivering his jokes rather than out at the audience. He'd be looking to the side, everywhere but the audience, and that's because he felt awkward on stage, and he talked about this in many interviews. His deliveries would often seem somewhat unconfident or spur of the moment rather than well considered. But these elements were part of his comedy, they led to the effectiveness of his jokes rather than detracting from that. Again, sort of a non-traditional example. Just to give one more example, the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who again you may or may not have heard of, was known as a sort of cult figure when he was alive. We don't have recordings of his classes and the delivery that he had in his classes, but we do know that there were a lot of students who really swore by his classes and really enjoyed the presentations that he gave. And there are stories about him doing things like sort of leaning over at his desk, his presentation desk, and just muttering to himself for like 30 minutes before standing back up and speaking to the class again. He'd go on tangents. He would explain, he would talk too quietly. You couldn't hear him. He'd like mutter to himself. And rather than finding this uncompelling or distracting, people actually found this to be a compelling mode of communication because they felt like they were watching, say, a genius at work. Someone who was so wrapped up in their own thought process that they couldn't be bothered with presenting to you, and it was up to you to try to figure out what exactly it is that they were talking about. All of this leads me to a general point about coming off well, which is that, in my opinion, the core of coming off well as a presenter is to come off as being genuine or passionate about the subject that you're discussing. All of the people I just mentioned, again, did not speak clearly necessarily, didn't always keep their eyes up, didn't always seem confident of what they were saying. But it did always seem to audiences that they really meant what they were saying and were really genuine about it. Wasn't going through so much of a filter. In my opinion, this is the main thing that matters to coming off well when you're giving a presentation. If you can come off as being genuine or passionate, the audience that you're presenting to will think, oh, I like this person. I think they're cool. Confident and clear presentations create a certain kind of impression. Again, if you just want people to like you by the end of the presentation, all you need to do is come off as being genuine or passionate about what you're discussing. But if you want people to think that you're like a well put together person, that you know what you're doing, then you need to embrace these kinds of aspects. Okay, and again, this can be important in many contexts. So it's not necessarily that this advice is wrong, but that maybe it's a little too limited. There are other ways of succeeding. One of the things that I also wanted to emphasize is that there's a kind of loop that goes on between what you might call like behaviors and what you might call mentalities, where if our behavior is something like, say, keeping your eyes up, then our mentality that we're trying to convey is something like confidence. And the more that we keep our eyes up, the more confident it will make us. And the more confident that we become, the easier it will be for us to keep our eyes up. So these two things kind of feed into each other. So when you're practicing, your goal should be to become more confident. And to do that, you're going to exercise these behaviors, which will lead to becoming more confident. And becoming more confident will make it easier to exercise those behaviors. It's a common theme in general. Okay. And finally, I'll very briefly discuss publication. This is again something that is maybe not something that you prioritize when you're just getting started doing presentations, but the further you go, the more important it will become. Things like copyright, plagiarism, these will become very important subjects, both for you not to get in trouble. You don't want your YouTube video getting taken down. You don't want to be barred from this event. And for you to be able to get credit for the things that you do so that no one else takes your stuff and doesn't without crediting you. It's good to think about these things early, even if you're not prioritizing them right now, to start building up good habits for when you're thinking about publishing later on in your career. Okay, talk about that a little bit more. We talk about the advice. Okay, speaking of which, now will come the section of the presentation where I give some general advice about how to pursue all of the goals that we've just discussed here. Okay. Now, the advice that I'm going to give, the idea of the advice that I'm going to give in this video is that it works for all the goals that I discussed. At the very least, doesn't detract from any of them. So it helps both to educate and to entertain and to help you come off well. It sort of does everything at once. And stuff that's not that hard to do. These are things that can be implemented relatively easily. In a presentation, you don't have to work that hard at them. Okay. The first thing I'll talk about is how to avoid overwhelming people, which I mentioned before as one of the more important things to do. Where if you give people too much information all at once, they just can't hold it all in, they start to tune out. One of the ways you can do this is to have few words on your slides. One of the most common issues in presentations is for people to put like everything they want to say up on the slide and to essentially just read off of the slide. This overwhelms people. It also makes you seem sort of unprepared. If you feel like you need to have something that you can read from in order to give your presentation effectively, you should really have your own separate notes, which we'll talk about soon. The words shouldn't all be on your slides. Another concept that can help is what I call staggering slides. If you're giving a slide-based presentation. And essentially what this means is that instead of putting everything you want to say on one slide, you put like half of what you want to say on a slide, and then you reveal the second half of what you want to say later. So you first talk about that first half, and then you add that second half on later. Again, I'll show some examples of this coming out. I've been sort of doing that throughout this presentation where instead of having pre-made graphics, which had all of the topics I want to discuss, I've been writing them as we've been going. So we focus on one, then we focus on the next one. Another important thing to do is if you're going to discuss some kind of key point you want to make, it's good to give multiple examples of that point. Rather than giving one example, you should say more than one. Give people more time to think about it, to really fully understand what you're saying. Again, I've been doing that throughout this presentation as well. Finally, and this kind of gets into coming off well, the goal of coming off well, you want to speak slower than you think you need to. You may have noticed that I am comfortable pausing when I present, taking a moment to collect some thoughts, maybe write something down. In general, just have a slower presentation. When people are first presenting, first getting experience doing that, they have a tendency to speak too quickly because they're nervous. And the best way to fight against this is to speak slower than you think you need to. That way you don't overwhelm people, you don't ramble. And there's a number of tricks that exist to try to help with this goal. Okay. Another thing that's good to include in slides are single large images with minimum accompaniment, where one of your slides is just a full screen image or maybe two images put next to each other, and you allow the audience that's attending your presentation to just sort of settle with that image. If you know the documentarian Ken Burns, this is very much his entire style, where he'll show a historical photo, let it sit up there for a few seconds as the topic is being discussed that the photo represents. You may have noticed I've been doing that throughout this presentation, where I just show you a picture of, say, Ludwig Wittgenstein and let it sit there. Again, if you've seen a Ken Burns documentary, you know exactly what I'm talking about, where there'll just be a picture of, say, some aspect of the Civil War, a discussion in the background, we'll talk about that aspect, and the picture will just sort of sit there, creating an impression on the observer. This does a number of important things. First of all, it's fairly easy to set this up. You just need to find one evocative image and slap it up there. It creates an impression in the observer, and it also gives you and them time to settle into the presentation and relax a little bit. You can label the images if needed. In general, it's better to add labels to an image than to create a separate slide describing that image. You'd rather have them overlapping with each other. On the other hand, you don't want it to be too busy. And just a few key labels. Okay. Another thing I can advise having are question or activity slides, which prompt the viewer to do some kind of activity or to answer some kind of question. This doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be just a simple question like, how do you feel about this topic? Or what do you know about this? Again, it can be a general question, it can be a specific question. You can make one slide where the only thing on that slide is just a question. And it's there more to prompt some kind of response or discussion. You can ask people to raise their hands if they have ever done this or ever seen this. There's a lot of ways to approach this, but it's a good thing to mix in because it keeps people engaged with the presentation. It breaks up the pacing, so it's not just you talking the whole time. It gives you a moment to collect your thoughts. It gives people a moment to collect their thoughts. These kinds of things can get very fancy. You can make a pretty involved activity depending on the context that you're in. It's often easier to have these kinds of things when you're presenting in person in a classroom. You can get fancy or you can keep it simple, but it's good to include these in some way. Again, there's a lot of advice about this if you're interested. Okay, another thing I would recommend is having a run of show. A run of show is essentially a document that describes what you'll be doing in the course of some kind of presentation, and when you'll be doing it, in what order, and maybe for how long. The term comes from entertainment contexts, any kind of live performance, a stage play, a TV show, a concert will often have a run of show that everybody reviews before the production goes on. In educational context, the same function is filled by a lesson plan, which will also sort of describe what is going to be done and when it's going to be done, and might have notes for the presenter to review. Here is an example of a run of show that I found. You can see that there's a sequence of steps here. There's something that describes generally what's going to happen. Someone walks in, time for welcome and applause, acknowledge the audience, how long it's going to take, when it's going to occur. Here, this particular run of show looks like it's for the behind the scenes type people, and so it talks about which mic they need to turn on and when, which video they need to turn on and when, which lights they need to turn on and when, which image is going to present on the screen. Again, this is a run of show for people who are sort of behind the scenes. The host of the show might get a different run of show that has more descriptions of what kind of things to talk about and what kind of cues to expect when to start and stop. What this looks like, this kind of document looks like, will change a lot depending on the nature of the presentation being given. You can have more notes about speaking and what you want to say, or less notes, more detail, less detail. In general, I think the more experience people get giving presentations, the less they need something like this, or the more simple it can be. In my opinion, it's all about finding what works for you, just having this general concept in mind, and then making something that will work in your own context. I'll also show you, and this is going to be a little bit meta here, but I have been using just such a document right now to give this presentation. You can see that I have my own run of show for this video right here. Here is the part where we talk about giving a run of show. Here are the notes that I took for myself. And you can see here's the part where we're talking about having a question or activity slide. And I've been using it the whole time. Haha, okay. Okay. So again, good thing to do if as you're preparing to give your presentation and deliver it. If I was doing one for like a 5-minute presentation or a quick presentation for class, as opposed to say for a TV show or for a long video, I might say something like slide 1, talk about whatever it is I want to talk about. Myself. Name, grade, topic of presentation. And then I might say slide 2, biography, whatever I'm presenting on. I would sort of tease it out like this. I might also say, okay, I expect to take 1 minute to talk about this. I expect to take 2 minutes to talk about this. Again, some kind of something like this, whatever works for you, very useful to do. Okay, and then the last thing that I would recommend, again, that works towards all of the goals and is not that hard to do, is to do some practice. Practice is very important. You can practice on your own or with family and friends. And the goal of when you are practicing is really to build your own confidence, get more comfortable, and maybe find some of the issues. Maybe your presentation is a little bit too long. You realize that when you practice giving it. It's a good idea to practice with a timer so you see how long you're taking. Even if there isn't a strict time limit, it's good just to know kind of how long it's going for. You might want to use notes at first, then stop using them to get used to that. And if you feel up to it, it's a good idea to record yourself and review those recordings, although people are often uncomfortable doing this, but if you do feel comfortable doing that, it's a good idea. Again, also a good idea to do with other people so that you can practice in front of a real audience in case that's something that makes you nervous as well. Okay, now, there's much more advice that I could give about this topic, but again, I don't want to overwhelm you with information right now. There's plenty of other sources that will give you more advice. Much of that advice will be good. The main thing that I'd recommend to you when you're reading that extra advice is, what goal is this advice moving me towards? Is this advice about how to create a presentation that will be more effective for educating people or for entertaining people? Is it advice about how to come off better? Are there some professional standards that this person is trying to get me to live up to that are maybe not being explicitly stated? Keep those things in mind as you go and learn more about this subject. Okay, I'll close things out by showing you a presentation that I made that I felt was pretty good, that it embodies a lot of these principles and that follows a lot of this advice. Um, this is a presentation that I made for one of my classes in graduate school. It is a biography of the educational psychologist Anne Leslie Brown, whose work is sort of influential to the way I think about education. And you'll see that I have done a lot of things in this presentation that I recommend doing when I'm giving the advice. Here you can see, it's showing you the behind the scenes one. But here you can see that I have the presentation here, and I have a sort of single large image here, which the idea is to just kind of situate you in 1943 in England. This is during World War II, and Brown was born in this air raid shelter. So here we have sort of a single large image, another single large image, again with just a label, get you situated. And then I give just some unaccompanied images. We're just trying to put ourselves in that historical time. You'll see I have some slight presentation notes over here. I have a little comparison that I want to make to keep in mind. Another little note here, a little bit of a joke I've put there on the side. Okay, now when I talked about staggering slides and not having too many words on slides, this is really what I'm talking about here. You can see here all of the slide says itself is Anne Brown and then quotation marks. And I've spread it out, so then I say had dyslexia, didn't learn to read until the age of 13, made honor roll at the University of London, and got her PhD in psychology at the age of 24. And you'll notice that I've left this sort of blank space in the middle here, which I then put this like question mark in, and the line that I say in class, and you can see I have a note for myself, is, well, how did she do that? How did she learn to read at the age of 13? Some stuff happened in between here, and then made honor roll at the University of London. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that weird? Later on in the presentation, I connect this personal life experience that Anne Brown had of having a learning disability, learning to read at a late age, and then reaching a high level of academic success to the kind of work that she chose to do. Where a lot of the work that Anne Brown did was with children from underprivileged backgrounds or with disabilities, maybe because of this personal experience that she had. Again, if I scroll through the rest of the presentation, you'll see that these kinds of principles are all over the place, where I have a little bit of information and then I show the rest of the information afterwards. have just a little bit of information, then I have a little information afterwards, then I direct people towards the information that I want to settle on, which leads to the next one where I sort of describe that. Again, single large image again. I didn't have as many questions or activities in this presentation as I would typically like to have because of the nature of the rules that I need to follow for the presentation. But I did take time to ask questions in the live setting. For example, here I talk about why Anne Brown's fostering communities of learners approach was not as influential as her reciprocal teaching approach. Don't worry about what these terms are if you haven't heard of them. The main point is that when I showed this slide, I made sure to pause here, and before revealing my arguments for why this approach was not as influential as this approach, I took the time in person to ask the class, why do you think this might have been the case? Just to sort of pose that question to them, and then I was like, well, here's what I think. Okay. I do have a recording on my YouTube channel of me giving this full presentation, if you'd like to check that out. Okay. So again, this video here is, despite its length, still really only an introduction to the subject, and I encourage you to go and find other resources. There are many good resources about how to make effective presentations and deliver effective presentations. When you go to those resources, keep in mind the implicit goals that that resource is directing you towards, or assuming that you have. Make informed choices, balance them, develop the skill set. Okay.